Hey guys, welcome back. I'm so glad you're here. Tonight we're going to be talking about something that feels both incredibly familiar and impossibly distant. We're going to talk about the Gladiator. I know. You've seen the movies. You've seen the chiseled heroes with their defiant speeches and their perfectly sculpted abs, fighting for freedom in a sun-drenched arena. It's a powerful image. It's also, well, it's mostly wrong. The real story, as it so often is far stranger, far grittier, and in its own quiet way, far more human. It's a story of incredible resilience, of staggering cruelty, and of a system so vast and so hungry that it would reach to the furthest corners of the known world to find men to feed its spectacle. It's the story of who these people actually were before the helmet and the sword were ever placed in their hands. As always, if you enjoy what we do here, if this quiet corner of the internet brings you a bit of peace, then I'd be so grateful if you'd consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It really is just me here, talking into the dark, and knowing you're out there listening makes all the difference. And as our little tradition goes, feel free to leave a comment letting us all know where in the world you're listening from tonight. It's a remarkable thing to think of us all, scattered across the globe, settling in for the same story together, a quiet global community. But that's enough of that. The housekeeping is done. It's time to let the day fall away. Find your comfortable spot. Dim the lights. Pull up the covers. Maybe you have a fan on, providing that gentle, steady hum. Take a slow, deep breath. Let your shoulders relax. Let the noise of your world fade into the background. There's nothing you need to do right now. Nowhere you need to be. Just be here. And let's take a journey back together. Back to the dust and the roar of ancient Rome. The condemned and the willing, the many paths to the arena. When we think of a gladiator, our minds tend to conjure a single epic archetype. He's a rebel, a wronged man, a Thracian king like Spartacus, forced into slavery and rising to challenge an empire. He is, in short, a hero fighting a system, and while men like that certainly existed, to imagine that every gladiator fit this mold is like assuming every person who works in an office today is the CEO. The reality was a complex, and often heartbreaking ecosystem of human supply and demand. The great grinding machinery of Roman entertainment needed fuel, and that fuel was human life. It was sourced from all over the empire, through a variety of channels, each with its own story of despair, desperation, or bewildering choice. The arena was the destination, but the paths that led to its bloody sand were many, and most of them began in a place of profound loss. To truly understand who these men were, we have to start at the edges of the empire. Imagine for a moment that you are not in your comfortable bed. You are in a damp, misty forest in Gaul, or perhaps on the windswept plains of Dacia, north of the Danube. Your world is one of tribe, of kinship, of gods who live in the ancient oaks and the rushing rivers. Rome is a story, a rumour whispered by merchants, a far-off city of stone and power, but not a reality that touches your day-to-day life. You are a warrior. You have a family, a name, a place in the world defined by your courage and your loyalty to your chieftain. Then, one day, the rumour becomes a reality. The legions arrive. They don't move like your warriors do, in a wild, passionate charge. They move like a machine, a great, terrifying tortoise of interlocking shields and stabbing spears, the gladius. They build roads where there were only tracks, forts where there were only hills. They bring order and taxes and a law that is not your own. And inevitably, there is war. You fight, as you have been taught to fight, with the courage of a man defending his home. But courage is not enough to stop the inexorable advance of the Roman war machine. In the chaos and the terror of a lost battle, you are surrounded. Your sword is broken. Your chieftain is dead. Your brothers in arms are scattered or slain, and you are taken. You are bound. Your hands tied so tightly the rope cuts into your flesh. This is the first step on the long road to the arena for countless thousands. You have become a prisoner of war, captivus. The psychological shock is something we can barely comprehend. In an instant, you are no longer a person. You are property. You are booty. Spoils of war, no different from a captured standard, a shield, or a sack of grain. You are now part of the vast, terrifyingly efficient Roman system of logistics. You are stripped of your arms, your armor, even your name. You become a number, a tally mark on a Roman quartermaster's wax tablet. You are herded with thousands of others, men from your own tribe, and men from tribes you fought against your whole life, now all reduced to the same miserable condition. The journey to the heart of the empire is an ordeal in itself. Chained together in long lines, you are marched for weeks, sometimes months. The world you knew, the smell of the forest, the taste of your water, the sound of your language is gone. It is replaced by the endless tramp of sandals on a stone-paved road, the dust kicked up by legions and supply carts, the incomprehensible chatter of your captors in their harsh, clipped Latin. You are given just enough food and water to keep you alive, because a dead prisoner is a worthless prisoner. You are an investment now, a walking piece of state-owned capital. Imagine seeing a Roman city for the first time. Not a frontier fort, but a real city. The scale of it would be bewildering, terrifying. Buildings taller than the highest trees in your forest, made of stone and marble that gleam in the sun. Aqueducts, great stone serpents snaking across the landscape, carrying water with a casual mastery of nature that seems like sorcery. And the people, so many people, a swirling, chaotic mass, speaking a language you don't understand. Their faces a mixture of curiosity, contempt, and utter indifference. To them you are a spectacle. You are the proof of Roman victory, a living trophy from a conquered land, paraded for their amusement. You might be part of a general's triumph, a grand parade through the streets of Rome itself, where the crowds cheer the conquering hero and jeer at you, the defeated barbarian. They see a stereotype, the wild-haired, bearded German, the fierce, mustachioed Gaul. They don't see a farmer, a father, a man who has lost everything. They see a caricature, a symbol of their own dominance. After the parade, you are sold. This is where the state cashes in on its investment. You are brought to a slave market, a bustling, brutal place of commerce. Here, the final vestiges of your old identity are systematically erased. You are put on a rotating platform, a sort of cruel human turntable, so potential buyers can inspect you from all sides. A sign, a titulus, is hung around your neck. It might list your place of origin, Germa, Gallus, Dacus, and perhaps any special skills you were observed to have. But mostly, it's a declaration of your new status, slave. Buyers would prod and poke you. They'd check your teeth like you were a horse, looking for signs of age or disease. They'd make you jump, run, lift heavy objects to test your strength and stamina. They'd look at the scars on your body, not as marks of a warrior's honor, but as indicators of a rebellious spirit or a durable constitution. And among the buyers would be a very particular type of man, a man with a keen eye for a certain kind of physique. He's not looking for a docile servant to carry wine at a dinner party, or a learned Greek to tutor his children. He is a Lannister, the owner and trainer of a gladiator school, or Ludus. The Lannister was one of the most reviled and fascinating figures in Roman society. He was a businessman, and his business was death. He was a trainer, a promoter, a slave driver, and a talent scout, all rolled into one. Socially, he was on the absolute bottom rung, considered no better than a pimp or a gravedigger. But a successful Lannister could become fabulously wealthy. He would stalk the slave markets looking for prime raw material. He'd look for men like you, tall, strong, with a warrior's spirit still flickering in your eyes, however dimmed by despair. He's not looking for obedience. He's looking for potential. He can beat obedience into you later. What he needs is that raw physical prowess. He pays the price. The state gets its money, and your ownership is transferred. You are no longer the property of the Roman people. You are the property of one man, and his sole purpose for you is to train you to fight and die for the entertainment of others. This was by far the most common path to the arena. It was a conveyor belt of conquest, turning defeated enemies into public spectacle. But not every gladiator began his journey on a foreign battlefield. The Roman world was built on slavery. It was the engine of their economy, and it supplied the ludi just as it supplied the mines, the farms, and the wealthy households. So our second path to the arena floor is that of the common slave, purchased specifically for this purpose. Imagine a different life. Perhaps you were born into slavery in a villa in Sicily. Your entire existence has been one of servitude. You've never known freedom, never known a life that wasn't dictated by the whims of a master. You work the fields, the latifundia, under the hot sun. It's a brutal, thankless existence, but it's the only one you know. You are strong, but maybe you are also defiant. You talk back, you work slowly, you break a tool, you are deemed difficult. Your master decides you are more trouble than you're worth as a farmhand. But that strength, that defiance, perhaps it could be profitable in another context. So your master sells you, not at the massive state-run market for prisoners of war, but at a local market to a travelling slave trader. You are once again inspected, prodded, and priced. The trader might see your powerful build and the fire in your eyes and think, this one is not for the fields. He knows that a prime specimen, a man with the right physical attributes, can fetch a much higher price from a Lannister than from a landowner, and so you are bought with a specific career path in mind. You are destined for the games. This route was different from that of the POW. You might not have the raw military training of a Gallic warrior, but you might also be more broken in to the concept of servitude. You speak Latin. You understand the brutal calculus of Roman society. Yet the destination is the same. You arrive at the gates of the Ludus, a place that is part barracks, part prison, part abattoir. The Lannister who buys you isn't just buying a body, he's making a calculated business decision. A good gladiator was an astonishingly expensive asset. The initial purchase price was just the beginning. He would then have to invest in your food, a special, high-carbohydrate diet of barley and beans, which earned gladiators the rather unflattering nickname hordery, or barley men. He had to pay for your training, your weapons, your armour, and crucially, your medical care. The doctors attached to a Ludus were some of the best in the Roman world. This wasn't out of any sense of compassion. It was simple economics. If you think about it, a gladiator's body was subjected to constant, extreme trauma, both in training and in combat. They were the premier trauma specialists of their day. They knew how to set bones, stitch wounds, and manage infections. A gladiator who died from an infected training wound was a catastrophic financial loss for the Lannister. He had to keep his investments alive and fighting. So while your life was one of constant violence and the ever-present threat of death, you might, ironically, receive better medical attention than the average poor Roman citizen. It's a strange and unsettling paradox. Your body was cherished as a valuable commodity, even as your life was considered utterly expendable. This was the cold, hard logic of the slave's path to the arena. You were a product. Your rebelliousness or your physical strength, which had made you unsuitable for one form of slavery, now made you perfectly suited for another, far more lethal form. You weren't a trophy of war. You were just a line item in a ledger, an asset purchased with the hope of a high return on investment through ticket sales and prize money. The end result was the same, the sand of the arena, but the journey there was one of commerce rather than conquest. Now, the Roman state was nothing if not practical. It had a constant supply of defeated enemies and a thriving internal slave trade. But it also had another resource it could tap for the games, its own criminals. This leads us to our third path, a path that was not one of misfortune or market economics, but of justice, or at least what passed for justice in ancient Rome. The sentence was called damnatio ad ludum, condemnation to the gladiator school. This was a specific punishment for serious crimes committed by the lower classes, murder, arson, banditry, and the like. It was, for all intents and purposes, a death sentence, but it was a death sentence with a twist. A damnatio ad gladium, condemnation to the sword, meant you would be executed in the arena with little ceremony. A damnatio ad bestias meant you would be thrown to the wild animals, a truly horrific fate reserved for the most hated criminals and later Christians. But damnatio ad ludum was different. It offered the slimmest, most improbable sliver of hope. If you were sentenced ad ludum, you were handed over to a lanista. The state essentially outsourced your execution to the private sector. The lanista would receive you for free, which was a great deal for him, no initial investment cost. He was obligated to train you and put you in the arena within a year. If you survived for 3 years of combat, you had a chance, a very small chance of winning your freedom. Not just freedom, but a wooden sword called a rudis, the symbol of your discharge. It sounds almost like a perverse form of rehabilitation through combat, the chance to redeem yourself in the eyes of the public. But we should be under no illusion. This was not about redemption. This was about providing a steady stream of free bodies to the games. Most men sentenced to Ludum did not survive their first fight. They were the disposable shock troops, often sent out in the opening acts of the games, the Prelucio, to warm up the crowd. They were given inferior equipment and pitted against more experienced gladiators, or in some cases, each other, in a fight to the death with no possibility of a reprieve. The psychology of the Dammatus, the condemned man, must have been unique. The prisoner of war could dream of his lost homeland. The slave could curse the master who sold him. But the criminal entered the Ludus with the full weight of the Roman legal system on his back. He was officially and publicly branded as someone whose life was forfeit. The crowd knew it. The other gladiators knew it. He was already dead, legally speaking. He was just waiting for the sentence to be carried out in the most spectacular way possible. And yet that tiny glimmer of hope, the rudis, must have been a powerful motivator to go from a condemned criminal, the lowest of the low, to a free man, adored by the very crowds who came to see you die. It's the stuff of legend. And it did happen, just often enough to keep the system viable. It created a narrative that the public could latch onto. The story of a man who, through sheer grit and martial prowess, clawed his way back from the brink. It was a potent piece of propaganda for the Roman system of justice. It suggested that even in this most brutal of punishments, there was a chance for a man to prove his virtus, his manly courage, and be rewarded for it. It was, of course, a lie for the vast majority, but it was a beautiful and compelling lie. So now we have our cast of characters: the captive warrior, stripped of his identity; the troublesome slave, sold as a commodity; the condemned criminal, fighting for a 1-in-a-million chance at life. This accounts for the vast majority of men who fought and died in the arenas of the empire. They were the unwilling, the coerced, the condemned. But there is one more path to the arena, and it is by far the most shocking, and to our modern sensibilities, the most difficult to understand. It was the path of the volunteer. These men were called auctoriatlaw. They were free Roman citizens, sometimes even from the upper classes, who voluntarily signed a contract, the auctorementum, with a lanista. By signing this contract and speaking a solemn oath to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword, they willingly surrendered their freedom and became, for a fixed period of time, the legal property of the lanista. They effectively became slaves. Why on earth would anyone do this? The reasons were as varied as the men themselves. The most common driver was crippling debt. For a Roman citizen, debt was a profound source of shame and could lead to the loss of property and status. Signing on as a gladiator offered a signing bonus that could wipe out a man's debts in one fell swoop. It was a devil's bargain. Trade your freedom and risk your life for a chance to clear your name and your ledger. You were exchanging social death for the risk of a very real one. For others, it was the allure of fame. Gladiators, despite their rock-bottom legal status, were the superstars of their day. They were the most famous people in the Roman world, after the emperor himself. Their images were scribbled as graffiti on walls, much like Caesar loves Cornelius might be found next to a crude drawing of a gladiator. They were featured in mosaics and on pottery. They were the subjects of breathless gossip. The most successful fighters were mobbed by fans, adored by women, and showered with prize money. For a young man with few prospects, a boring life in a small town, and a thirst for glory, the arena offered a shortcut to a level of fame and adoration that was otherwise unattainable. It was the ancient world's most extreme, high-stakes reality television show, and for some, it might have been a simple, nihilistic desire for a life of intense, thrilling purpose. Ex-soldiers, men who had served in the legions and found civilian life crushingly dull, were often drawn to the ludus, the discipline, the camaraderie, the daily focus on combat. It was a world they understood. They could continue to live by the sword, but this time with the promise of individual glory instead of the anonymity of the legionary ranks. The Orchestratus presents a fascinating paradox. He was a free man who chose slavery. He was a citizen who chose to become an outcast, and in doing so, he threw the whole Roman social order into a state of delicious confusion. Here was a man who, by all rights, should be sitting in the stands, watching the spectacle. Instead, he was down on the sand, a part of it. This was both thrilling and deeply scandalous to the Roman elite. They were disgusted by the choice, yet utterly captivated by the results. When an Aucturatus signed his contract, he agreed to a price. This was the price of his life, should he be killed in the arena. If he was killed, the Lannister would be compensated by the editor, the sponsor of the games. It was a morbid form of life insurance. The contract would specify the term of service, perhaps 3 to 5 years, and the signing bonus. For that period, he was subject to the same brutal discipline as any other gladiator. He could be whipped, chained, and punished at the Lannister's whim. He ate the same barley mush, slept in the same cramped cells, and faced the same risk of a violent death. But he was different. He remembered what it was to be free, and unlike the prisoner of war or the slave, he had a clear end date to his servitude. If he survived his contract, he was a free man again, and often a very wealthy one. He would be awarded the Ludus, the wooden sword, and could walk away from the arena forever. Some did. They retired, bought land, and lived out their days in comfort. Others, however, became addicted to the life. They couldn't adjust to the quiet of the civilian world, and so they would sign on for another term. Professional veterans who became trainers for new recruits, or continued to fight, their market value increasing with every victory. This brings us to one of the most important and pervasive concepts surrounding all gladiators, regardless of their origin, the legal status of infamia. Infamia meant, literally, disgrace. It was a formal, legal classification that stripped a person of their civic rights and social standing. People who were infamous could not vote, could not hold public office, and could not represent others in a court of law. It was a category reserved for those who sold their bodies for the entertainment or service of others. The list of the infamous is quite telling. It included actors, prostitutes, pimps, and gladiators. Think about that for a moment. To the Romans, the man who stood on a stage and pretended to be someone else was in the same legal gutter as the man who fought to the death for a cheering crowd. Both were seen as putting their bodies on public display for money, which, to the deeply conservative Roman elite, was a profound dishonor. This meant that no matter how famous a gladiator became, no matter how much money he earned or how many fans adored him, he was, in the eyes of the law, a non-person, a social pariah. And yet, here is the central, delicious contradiction of the gladiator. He was simultaneously the most degraded and the most adored figure in Roman society. He was an outcast who was also a sex symbol. Wealthy Roman matrons were known to have affairs with gladiators, a practice that was both a titillating scandal and apparently quite common. The sweat of a victorious gladiator was considered a powerful aphrodisiac, scraped from his body with a tool called a strigil, bottled in tiny vials, and sold to eager female fans outside the amphitheatre. It was the ancient world's equivalent of a rock star's used guitar pick, only far, far more personal. This paradox is key to understanding the gladiator's place in the world. He lived in a bizarre limbo. He was legally dead, yet intensely alive. He was socially worthless, yet culturally priceless. He was an object of both contempt and desire. For the prisoner of war or the slave, this might have been just another layer of their dehumanization. But for the Aucturatus, the free man who chose this life, it was a core part of the bargain. He had to consciously accept his own social damnation in exchange for the chance at fortune and glory. So these are our 4 main paths to the sand. The conquered warrior, a symbol of Rome's power; the defiant slave, a commodity in a brutal market; the condemned criminal, a pawn in a deadly game of justice; and the free citizen, a gambler wagering his life and honor for a prize. Each man who stood on the arena floor carried with him the story of his own unique journey, a history of loss, coercion, or desperate choice. When they arrived at the Ludus, these disparate men from different worlds were all forced into the same crucible. The gladiator school was designed to do one thing: strip away their past and forge them into effective killing machines. Their names were taken from them. A German warrior named Alaric might be given a stage name like Germanus, or something more evocative, like Ferox, fierce, or Triumphus. This was part of the process of creating a public persona, a character for the crowd to cheer or boo. It was also a way of severing the last link to their former lives. The man you were before the Ludus was dead. Only the Gladiator remained. The training was relentless and brutal. They would start with wooden swords and wicker shields, practicing endless drills against a wooden post called a palace. The trainers, often retired gladiators who had won their freedom, were merciless. They used whips and rods to enforce discipline. A mistake could earn you a lashing. Cowardice could earn you a death sentence. Here, in the enclosed world of the training yard, a new hierarchy was established. It didn't matter if you were a Celtic chieftain or a petty thief from the slums of Rome. All that mattered was your skill with a blade, your stamina, and your willingness to kill. A strange sort of brotherhood, a familiar gladiatoria, often formed in these schools. These men, who were being trained to kill each other for sport, lived, ate, and slept together. They were isolated from the outside world, their entire existence confined to the barracks and the training yard. They were all in the same hopeless situation, facing the same terrifying future. They would have understood each other in a way no outsider ever could. They might form friendships, bonds forged in the shared experience of extreme duress, and then one day the lists would be posted for the next games, and you might see your friend's name next to your own. You would be expected to walk out onto the sand and try to kill him, while thousands of people screamed for blood. The psychological torment of this existence is almost impossible for us to fully grasp. It's easy to see why the Romans were so obsessed with gladiators. In them they saw their most cherished and most feared values played out in stark relief. They saw virtus, the courage to face death without flinching. They saw the triumph of Roman order over barbarian chaos in the defeated POWs. They saw the sternness of their justice in the condemned criminals, and they saw a thrilling, terrifying rejection of that order in the voluntary submission of the auctorati. The gladiator was a mirror, reflecting the best and worst of Rome itself. But for the men themselves, the philosophy was likely much simpler. It was about survival. Every day you woke up in the Ludus was a victory. Every meal was a gift. Every training session you survived was a reprieve. The journey to the arena was a process of systematic dehumanization, designed to turn a man into a weapon, a spectacle, a thing. And yet, what is so remarkable, what has allowed their stories to echo through millennia, is that through it all, they remained stubbornly, resiliently human. Whether they were captured, sold, condemned, or signed on of their own free will, they each began as someone else. A man with a name, a home, and a life, before the shadow of the Colosseum fell over them, and their long, unwilling, and sometimes all too willing journey to the arena began. Forged in the Ludus, the making of a killing machine. And that journey, for every single one of them, began at the gates of a place called a Ludus, the gladiatorial school. And if the word school brings to your mind images of ivy-covered walls, quiet libraries, or even just a standard high school gymnasium, it's best to gently set those thoughts aside. The Ludus was, to put it mildly, a multi-purpose facility. It was one part prison, one part military barracks, and one part the most brutally demanding athletic training centre the world had ever seen. It was a factory, and its sole product was a very specific kind of human being, one conditioned to kill and prepared to die for the entertainment of thousands. Upon arrival, whether dragged in chains as a prisoner of war, or walking in with the hollow resignation of a condemned criminal, the first order of business was the complete and total erasure of a man's former self. Your name? Gone. You were given a new one, a stage name, something punchy and memorable. Your hair? Shaved off. Your clothes? Stripped away and replaced with a simple loincloth. You were no longer a farmer from Gaul, a soldier from Britannia, or a fisherman from Greece. You were now raw material. You were a tyro, a novice, the lowest possible rung on a very tall and very slippery ladder. And to formalize this transition, you would swear the oath, the Sacramentum Gladiatorium. You would speak the words aloud, sealing a pact, not with a god, but with your new owner, the Lannister. You would swear, you're to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. Think about that for a moment. It's not a pledge of allegiance, it's a release of liability. It's the ancient world's most terrifying terms and conditions agreement, and you are clicking I accept with your own life. You are formally giving your owner permission to do anything to your body, up to and including your own destruction. Psychologically, this was the first and most important step. It was the moment you ceased to be a person with rights and became an investment, a piece of property with a pulse. The man who owned that pulse, the Lannister, was a fascinating and often reviled figure in Roman society. He was a businessman, a promoter, a talent scout, and a prison warden all rolled into one. The upper crust of Roman society looked down on Lannister. They saw them as profiteers of death, dealing in the unsavory business of human flesh, but they also desperately needed them. A praetor looking to curry favor with the people needed games, and for games you needed gladiators, and so they would hold their noses and do business with the Lannister. For the Lannister, his gladiators were his portfolio, a stable of high-risk, high-reward assets. He would walk through the courtyard of his Ludus, not seeing men, but seeing potential profits and losses. That big Thracian in the corner, he cost a fortune, but he's a crowd pleaser. He'll pay for himself in 2 fights. The new recruit from Pannonia, he looks quick, maybe make him a Retinarius. That one with the sullen eyes, he's got a rebellious streak, keep an eye on him. Every decision was a cold, hard calculation. The Lannister wasn't necessarily interested in creating the most efficient killer. He was interested in creating the most entertaining killer. His job was to build a roster of performers who could put on a good show, and a good show meant drama, suspense, and a satisfying, often bloody conclusion. The physical space of the Ludus itself was designed for control, high walls, barred cells, and a central training yard that was always under the watchful eye of guards and trainers. The cells, or cellae, were small, often shared, and offered the bare minimum of comfort. This wasn't a place for personal reflection, it was a holding pen. The sounds would have been a constant barrage, the rhythmic clang of wood on wood from the training yard, the grunts of exertion, the sharp commands of the trainers, the murmur of dozens of men speaking different languages, and underneath it all, a constant simmering tension. And the smells, the smell of sweat, of unwashed bodies crammed together, the sharp tang of sawdust and damp earth in the arena, the coppery scent of blood from training injuries, and the pervasive aroma of the gladiator's specialized diet, because the first thing the Lannister and his staff did, after breaking you psychologically, was to start building you physically, and the fuel for this transformation was not what you might expect. We have this modern image of an elite athlete's diet: lean protein, complex vegetables, carefully measured everything. The gladiator's diet was almost the opposite of that. They were nicknamed hordieri, which literally means barley men. Their diet was an intentionally carb-heavy, mushy slurry of barley, beans, oats and ash. Yes, ash. It was thought that the ash, rich in minerals, helped with bone strength and recovery. It was a stodgy, bland, fattening porridge, washed down with water or cheap, sour wine. The goal here wasn't to get six-pack abs. A chiseled, lean physique, while aesthetically pleasing to us, was a liability in the arena. The Lannister wanted his gladiators to be, well, a bit doughy. They were bulking up, intentionally cultivating a thick layer of subcutaneous fat over their powerful muscles. And there was a brutally practical, show business logic to this. That layer of fat acted as a buffer. A glancing blow from a sword would slice through the fat and produce a lot of blood, which the crowd loved, but it wouldn't necessarily sever a critical muscle or hit an organ. It allowed for more spectacular, non-lethal wounds. A fighter could be cut multiple times, bleeding dramatically, making the fight look far more brutal and desperate than it might actually be, without immediately ending his ability to perform. It prolonged the show. A gladiator with a low body fat percentage was a fragile, expensive investment. One nick in the wrong place, and he's out of commission. A barley man, on the other hand, could absorb superficial damage and keep going, so they would sit, day after day, eating this bland, heavy mush, building the body the Lannister required, a body designed not just for fighting, but for being wounded in the most theatrically effective way possible. With the body being fueled, the real work began, the training. The man in charge of this was the doctor, or trainer, often a retired gladiator himself, who had won his freedom. These weren't kindly coaches, they were harsh taskmasters, who knew that a moment's hesitation or a flaw in technique would mean death in the real arena. The hierarchy was clear. At the top was the Lannister, the owner. Beneath him were the Doctors, each specializing in a particular fighting style, and under them were the Gladiators, ranked by skill and experience. A new Tiro would start with the absolute basics. He would be handed a Ludus, a wooden sword, and a heavy wicker shield. The training weapons were often deliberately made to be twice the weight of the real steel weapons used in the arena. The logic was simple. If you can train for hours swinging a 20-pound wooden sword, a 10-pound steel gladius will feel as light as a feather when the adrenaline is pumping. The early days were a monotonous hell of footwork drills, conditioning, and endless practice against a stationary wooden post called a palace. They would learn the basic stances, the blocks, the parries, the thrusts. Not wild, cinematic swings, but brutally efficient, energy-conserving movements. The goal of a Roman fighter was not to disarm an opponent with a flashy move, but to create an opening and deliver a short, sharp, lethal thrust. Every movement was drilled into them until it was pure muscle memory. Exhaustion was a tool used by the Doctors. They would push the men past their limits, breaking them down to rebuild them stronger, faster, and more obedient. Disobedience or lack of effort was met with the whip. The words of the oath to be beaten were not just symbolic. Once a Tiro had mastered the fundamentals, a decision would be made. What kind of gladiator would he become? This wasn't his choice. It was a calculation made by the Lannister and the Doctors based on his physique, his natural aptitude, his speed, and his size. The genius of the Roman games was in the matchups. They rarely, if ever, pitted two identically armed fighters against each other. That would be boring. The spectacle came from the contrast, the rock-paper-scissors dynamic of specialized fighting styles. Each type of gladiator was a finely tuned package of strengths and weaknesses, designed to be pitted against a specific counterpart. Let's begin with one of the most classic types, the Murmillo. The Murmillo was the heavyweight, the tank of the arena. He was the spiritual successor to the old Samnite gladiator, representing the quintessential Roman legionary. He carried a scutum, the large rectangular shield of the Roman infantry, and a gladius, the short stabbing sword. His protection was a heavy bronze helmet, with a wide brim, and a distinctive crest shaped like a fish, which is where his name, from the Greek word for a type of sea fish, likely came from. He wore a guard on his right arm, the manica, and a greave on his left leg. The Murmillo was pure power and defense. He would advance behind his massive shield, a walking fortress, looking for an opportunity to deliver a deadly thrust with his gladius. His training would focus on strength, shield discipline, and the economy of motion. No wasted energy, just a relentless grinding advance. Who do you put a walking fortress up against? You need someone who can counter his strengths. Enter the Thratix, or the Thracian. The Thratix was the polar opposite of the Murmillo in many ways. He was an agile, lighter fighter. His shield was a small square or rectangular one, the Parmula, which offered far less protection but allowed for much greater mobility. His signature weapon was the Psyker, a short curved sword like a scythe, designed to hook around the edges of a large shield like the Murmillo's scutum and strike at the back of the neck or legs. His helmet was also distinctive, fully enclosing the head with a broad brim and topped with a griffin crest. He wore armoured greaves on both legs, since they were more exposed due to his smaller shield. The classic matchup was Murmillo versus Thrax. It was a clash of styles, the heavy defensive Roman against the nimble, aggressive barbarian. It was power versus speed, the straight sword versus the curved blade. It was a narrative the Roman crowd understood instantly. Another common opponent for the Murmillo was the Hoplomachus. He was similar in spirit to the Thracians, another foreign warrior type meant to evoke Rome's enemies. The Hoplomachus was styled after a Greek hoplite soldier. He carried a small round bronze shield, a spear, hasta, and a dagger or short sword for close quarters fighting. His strategy was to keep the heavily armoured Murmillo at a distance with the spear, probing for weaknesses. If the spear broke or was lost, he had to close in with his dagger, a terrifying prospect against a man with a giant shield and a gladius. Again, the matchup tells a story, the Roman legionary versus the Greek hoplite, a reenactment of old rivalries played out for the crowd's amusement. But perhaps the most bizarre and iconic matchup of all, the one that truly showcases the Roman genius for entertainment, was the battle between the Retiarius and the Secutor. The Retiarius, or Netman, was the most lightly armed of all gladiators, and in many ways the most vulnerable. He wore almost no armour at all, just a loincloth, an arm guard manica on his left arm, and a tall metal shoulder guard called a gallerus, which helped protect his neck and head. He had no helmet, no shield. His face was completely visible to the crowd, which was unique. It allowed them to see his fear, his desperation, his triumph. His weapons were a weighted net rete, a long trident, faschina, and a small dagger, pugio. His entire strategy was based on speed, agility, and cunning. He was the trickster, the fisherman. He would dance around his opponent, looking for the perfect moment to cast his net. If the net entangled his foe, he would move in to finish him with the trident. If he missed, he was in deep trouble. He would have to reel in the net, all while dodging the relentless advance of his opponent, and try again. He was always on the back foot, always one mistake away from death. And who was his opponent? The Secutor, the chaser or pursuer. The Secutor was created for one purpose, and one purpose only, to kill the Retiarius. He was a variation of the Mamillo, armed with the same large scutum and gladius, but his helmet was the key. It was completely smooth, rounded, and enclosed his entire head, with only 2 tiny eye holes. There were no crests, no ridges, nothing for the net to snag on. It was a terrifying, almost alien-looking piece of equipment. It also severely restricted his vision and hearing, and was incredibly hot and suffocating. The Secutor's strategy was as simple as his name, chase. He would relentlessly pursue the nimble Retiarius around the arena, protecting himself with his shield, trying to corner him and end the fight quickly before he exhausted himself inside that smothering helmet. This matchup was pure psychological theatre. You had the nimble, vulnerable, human-faced Retiarius against the heavily armed, implacable, faceless Secutor. It was speed versus power, trap versus tank, man versus monster. The crowd adored it. It was a story of survival and pursuit played out in real time. The Retiarius was often the underdog, and the Romans loved a good underdog story. His survival depended entirely on his skill and his nerve. Training for these specialized roles was intense. A man destined to be a Retiarius would spend endless hours casting the net, learning to let it unfurl perfectly. He'd practice the footwork needed to stay just out of reach of a Secutor's sword. A trainee Secutor would be forced to wear his heavy, suffocating helmet for long periods, learning to fight with limited senses, learning to pace himself to manage his oxygen. The doctors would run them through drills against their likely opponents, over and over again, shouting corrections, pointing out fatal flaws. A Thriax would learn how to use his small shield, not just for defense but as a weapon, to punch and create openings. A Murmillo would practice holding his ground, using his shield to absorb punishment and shove his opponent off balance. This constant, brutal training forged a strange sort of community. These men lived together, ate the same bland food together, suffered the same brutal discipline together. They were rivals, yes. The man you shared a meal with in the morning might be the man you were forced to kill in the afternoon. But they were also the only people in the world who understood the reality of their existence. A bond, a camaraderie, was inevitable. They were, in the truest sense, brothers in arms. We see evidence of this in the form of collegia, or burial clubs. Gladiators would pool what little money they earned to ensure that their fallen comrades would receive a proper burial and a commemorative tombstone. These tombstones are incredibly poignant. They list the gladiator's name, his fighting style, his number of fights, his wins, and sometimes a simple message of farewell from his comrades. To Flamma, the Secutor, who lived 30 years, fought 34 times, won 21 times, fought to a draw 9 times, was granted reprieve 4 times. His comrades in arms paid for this from their own funds. It was a way of reclaiming their identity, of ensuring they were remembered as a man, not just a spectacle. It was a final act of defiance against a system that sought to reduce them to nothing more than a statistic. And within this strange family, there was a clear hierarchy. You started as a tyro. If you survived and showed promise, you would move up the ranks. The best gladiators were known as primi pali, or first swords. These were the veterans, the stars. They got better food, better living quarters, maybe even their own private cells. They were the ones the crowds knew by name. They were celebrities, their images scratched into graffiti on walls, their exploits discussed in bathhouses across the empire. It was a bizarre paradox of Roman society. As a gladiator, you were technically infamous, a person of ill repute, legally on par with prostitutes and actors. You had no civil rights, and yet you could also be one of the most famous and admired men in Rome. Roman women would swoon over popular gladiators. Some would even pay for a night with their favorite fighter. They were the rock stars of their day, living a life of utter degradation and dazzling fame all at once. Of course, with this level of intense, violent physical activity, injuries were not a risk, they were a daily certainty. And this brings us to one of the most surreal aspects of the Ludus, the quality of its medical care. Alanista's gladiators were his prized assets. A top-tier gladiator could be worth a fortune. Letting one die from an infected wound or a poorly set bone was just bad business. So paradoxically, these men who were destined for violent death received some of the best medical care available in the ancient world. The Ludus employed its own physicians, and they were often at the cutting edge of medical science. The most famous of these was Galen, one of the most influential physicians in all of history. For a time, he served as the chief physician to the Ludus in his home city of Pergamum. He later said that the post was a perfect window into the human body. He treated gruesome wounds, deep cuts, punctured lungs, exposed intestines. He experimented with new surgical techniques, developed theories on anatomy and physiology, and became an expert in diet and fitness. He learned more about the inner workings of the human body by patching up gladiators than he ever could have by just dissecting animals. The care was meticulous. Wounds were cleaned with wine or vinegar to disinfect them. Doctors stitched up torn muscles and performed complex surgeries to repair damage. They prescribed diets to aid recovery and developed physical therapy regimens. A gladiator with a broken leg wasn't just left to heal crookedly. The bone would be carefully set so he could fight again. In an era when a simple cut could lead to a fatal infection for the average Roman citizen, a gladiator had a team of specialists dedicated to keeping him alive and in fighting condition. It is a stunning irony. The Lannister would spend a fortune to save a man's life, to nurse him back to perfect health, for the sole purpose of sending him back into the arena to risk it all over again. It wasn't compassion, it was asset management. The gladiator's body was a machine, and the doctors were the mechanics, there to keep it running no matter the cost. So you have the psychological conditioning, the specialized diet, the relentless training, the bizarre social structure, and the expert medical care. All of these elements worked in concert to take a man, a farmer, a soldier, a criminal, and remold him. The Ludus was a crucible. It used pressure, heat, and violence to burn away everything a man was and forge him into something new. It forged him into a performer, a warrior, a symbol. It turned him into a gladiator, a living weapon conditioned for the sand and the roar of the crowd. The day would eventually come when a gladiator was deemed ready. His training was complete, his body was honed, his mind was hardened. The Lannister would have negotiated a contract for his appearance at the upcoming games, or Munera. The gladiator would march out of the Ludus, part of a grand parade through the city streets, a living advertisement for the bloodshed to come. He would see the faces of the citizens, the people who would soon be cheering for his death or his victory, and he would walk towards the towering edifice of the amphitheatre, the place where all his training, all his pain, all his conditioning would finally be put to the ultimate test. He was leaving the factory and heading to the showroom floor. He was leaving the Ludus and entering the arena. A day at the games, the theatre of cruelty and imperial propaganda. And so he steps out of the darkness and into the light, not the gentle light of dawn or the forgiving glow of a lamp, but the hard, unfiltered, pitiless glare of the Italian sun, amplified by 80,000 pairs of eyes. He was leaving the Ludus and entering the arena. The noise hits him first. It's not just loud, it's a physical thing, a wave of sound that presses in on him from all sides, a chaotic symphony of shouts and murmurs and laughter that echoes off the towering stone walls. After the focused, disciplined quiet of the training grounds, this is an assault on the senses. The air itself tastes different here. It's thick with the smells of the city, sweat, cheap wine, roasted food, but underneath it all is the sharp metallic tang of what this place is for. It smells of sand, of dust, and faintly of old blood. This wasn't the showroom floor. This was the abattoir. This was the Colosseum. Or perhaps it was the amphitheatre at Capua, or Verona, or any of the hundreds of arenas scattered across the Roman Empire like stony, unblinking eyes. They were all built for the same purpose, to host the Munera, the games, and the day always began in the same way, with a grand and glorious parade called the Pompa. This was the opening ceremony, the official start to the day's festivities, and it was pure, unadulterated spectacle. Think of it as a cross between a military parade, the opening of the Olympics, and the walk-on for a heavyweight title fight, all rolled into one. The gates would swing open, and a procession would wind its way onto the freshly raked sand. First came the lictors, the official bodyguards of Roman magistrates, their bundles of rods and axes, a clear and present reminder of the state's power over life and death. Then came the musicians, a cacophony of horns, trumpets, and even a water-powered organ, the hydraulis, creating a soundtrack for the day's events that was probably less stirring symphony and more enthusiastic noise. Then came men carrying platforms and placards, showing images of the gods, the emperor, and advertising the gladiators who were scheduled to fight. It was a rolling billboard of piety and violence. Following them would be the man of the hour, the editor, the sponsor of the games. This was his big day. He might be a wealthy magistrate trying to win votes, or the emperor himself, reaffirming his connection with the people. He would be dressed in the finest purple-bordered toga, waving to the crowd, soaking in the adulation. For him this was a colossal investment. He was paying for the gladiators, the exotic animals, the executioners, the maintenance, the free food that was sometimes distributed. It was the most expensive and most effective political advertising campaign in the ancient world. And then finally came the main attraction, the gladiators. They marched in, not as a ragged band of slaves, but as a disciplined troupe of professional athletes. Their armour, the same armour we looked at in such detail, would be polished to a blinding sheen, the bronze of a secutor's helmet, the intricate carvings on a thracer's greaves, the polished points of the retiarius's trident. It was all designed to catch the sun and the eye of the crowd. They were property, yes, but for this moment they were stars. They would circle the arena, a lap of honour before a single drop of blood was shed. They would stop before the emperor's box, or the box of the editor, raise their right arms in a salute, and well, here we run into a bit of a Hollywood myth. We all know the line, Ave, Imperator, morituri te salutant. Hail, Emperor. We who are about to die salute you. It's a fantastic line. It's dramatic. It's fatalistic. It's perfect. The only problem is, it almost certainly wasn't a standard greeting. The only time it's ever recorded in ancient history is from one very specific event, under the Emperor Claudius, where a group of criminals and prisoners of war, forced into a naval battle on a lake, said it to him. It was a plea from condemned men, not the professional mantra of trained gladiators. A professional gladiator didn't plan on dying. He planned on winning, on earning his pay, on surviving to fight another day. He was there to work. To say we who are about to die salute you would be like a modern surgeon walking into the operating room and announcing, well, I'm probably going to lose this one, but here goes nothing. It's just bad for business, and bad for morale. But the image is so powerful, it has stuck with us for 2,000 years. A testament to how we want to see the gladiators as tragic heroes, marching gracefully towards a predetermined doom. The reality was messier and far more professional. Once the parade was over, the sand was raked one last time, and the day's programming could begin. The Roman games were a full-day affair, structured almost like a 3-act play. The morning was for the light entertainment, the afternoon was for the main event, and the bit in the middle, well, the bit in the middle was for clearing out the undesirables. The morning session was called the venations, the wild animal hunts. To our modern minds accustomed to conservation and zoos, this is one of the most alien parts of the Roman games. For the Romans, It was an incredible display of the reach and power of their empire. The sheer logistics of it are staggering. Imagine the effort required to capture, cage and ship a rhinoceros from Africa, or a tiger from the Parthian frontier, all the way to Rome, keeping it alive and angry for its grand debut. This was a global supply chain of exotic death. They brought in lions from Mesopotamia, leopards from North Africa, bears from Scotland and Germany, crocodiles from the Nile, elephants, ostriches, wild boars. It was a Noah's Ark of victims. The appearance of these creatures in the arena must have seemed like a form of magic to the average Roman. Most people in the crowd would never have seen such an animal before. They didn't have nature documentaries. They had rumors and travelers' tales. And then suddenly, right there in the middle of their city, a trapdoor in the sand would fly open, and a lion would be lifted into the arena on a wooden elevator. This is where the genius of the Colosseum's design truly shines. Beneath the wooden sand-covered floor of the arena was a vast two-story subterranean labyrinth called the Hypogeum. You can still see it today, an exposed skeleton of tunnels and passages. This was the backstage area, the engine room of the spectacle. It was a maze of holding pens for the animals, cells for the condemned, and armories for the gladiators. It was filled with a complex system of ramps, elevators and trapdoors, dozens of them. These elevators, the pegmata, were powered by complex systems of ropes, pulleys and capstans, turned by hundreds of slaves in the dark, sweltering confines of the Hypogeum. On a cue from above, these slaves would begin to heave, and a cage containing a pack of leopards could be hoisted up and released into the sunlight in a matter of seconds. They could even hoist up elaborate scenery, trees, rocks, hills, to create a mock forest or a desert landscape for the hunt. One moment, the arena is a flat expanse of sand. The next, it's a small patch of Germania, complete with imported trees and very confused, very angry bears. The men who fought these animals were called venatores, or bestiari. Some were skilled professionals, specialist hunters who used spears, bows and daggers with incredible agility. They were athletes in their own right, and a famous venatores could earn a good living. They would work in teams, reenacting hunts, gracefully dodging the charge of a boar or leaping over the lunge of a lion. It was a deadly ballet. But many of the bestiari were simply condemned criminals, unarmed, or perhaps given a useless dagger. They were just fed to the beasts. This was a form of execution, ad bestias, and it was a crowd pleaser. The morning show was a mix of skilled hunting and brutal state-sanctioned slaughter. For the Romans, it served a dual purpose. It was a thrilling spectacle, a chance to see the bizarre and terrifying creatures from the farthest reaches of their world. And it was a demonstration of power. It said, "We, the Romans, can go to the ends of the earth, capture its most fearsome monsters, and bring them here to die for your entertainment. We dominate not just other nations, but nature itself." By midday, the morning's animal blood has been soaked up by the sand, the carcasses have been dragged away, and it's time for lunch. The wealthier, more respectable members of the audience might leave the amphitheatre now, heading out to nearby taverns for a meal and some wine. They knew what came next, and it wasn't for the faint of heart. The people who remained in their seats were the true connoisseurs of cruelty, the ones who didn't want to miss a moment of the action, because the midday show, the meridian, was the time for public executions. If you thought being thrown to the beasts was bad, well, the Romans had a flair for variety. This was the part of the day when the state took care of its dirty work, out in the open for all to see. It was the ultimate deterrent. The message was simple and brutally effective. This is what happens when you break Roman law. This is what happens to deserters, to murderers, to arsonists, and during times of persecution to Christians. The methods were varied and grotesquely theatrical. There was simple crucifixion, a long, agonizing and humiliating death. There was burning at the stake, and then there were the more creative executions. The Romans loved their mythology, and they saw no reason why a public execution shouldn't also be an educational reenactment. A condemned criminal might be dressed up in a feathered costume to look like Icarus, hoisted to the top of the amphitheatre, and then dropped onto the sand. Another might be forced to wear a tunic soaked in pitch, the tunica molesta, and be set on fire to represent Hercules dying on his funeral pyre. These weren't just killings, they were gruesome passion plays. They were designed to be memorable, to be talked about. The horror was the point. It was a form of mass communication, a visceral press release from the Department of Justice, reminding every single citizen of the consequences of crime. To our sensibilities, it's almost incomprehensibly barbaric. To the Romans, it was a necessary, even normal part of maintaining social order, and for the crowd that stayed to watch, it was just part of the day's entertainment, a grim appetizer before the main course. And so, as the afternoon sun begins to dip in the sky, the real show is about to begin. The lunch-goers have returned to their seats. The grim remnants of the midday show have been cleared away, and a fresh layer of sand has been laid down. The trumpets sound again, and the mood shifts from the grim duty of the executions to the thrilling anticipation of the gladiatorial bouts. This is what everyone has been waiting for. The pairings were not random. The fights were carefully arranged by the Lannister and the editor to create the most exciting matchups. This was the science of the arena. They pit different styles of fighters against each other, a delicate balance of strengths and weaknesses. It was the classic contest of speed versus power, defense versus offense. The heavily armored, slow-moving Secutor or Murmillo, with their big shields and short swords, would be pitted against the nimble, barely armored Retiarius, the net and trident fighter. It was a fascinating tactical battle. The Retiarius had to stay at a distance, using his speed to tire out the heavyweight, looking for the perfect moment to cast his net. If he could entangle his opponent, he had the advantage, but if he missed, or if the Secutor could close the distance, the Retiarius, with no shield and no helmet, was incredibly vulnerable. There were dozens of other types. The Thraerx, with his small square shield and curved Thracian sword, was a fast attacker. The Hoplomachus, modelled on a Greek hoplite soldier, had a spear and a small round shield. There were even gladiators who fought on horseback, equites, or from chariots, aceterae. Each pairing presented a different set of tactical problems to be solved. This wasn't just a mindless brawl, it was in its own way a martial art, the sweet science of brutality. The crowd would have their favourites, just like modern sports fans. They would know the fighters, their records, their signature moves. They would bet on the outcomes, shouting advice and encouragement from the stands. And the fight itself was not a fight to the death. Not usually. This is another major misconception. Gladiators were incredibly valuable assets. They were expensive to acquire, to feed, and to train in a highly specialized skill set. A Lannister did not want to lose his investment after a single fight. The goal was not to kill the opponent, but to defeat them. A gladiator was defeated when he was disarmed, or wounded so severely he could no longer fight. At this point, the fight would be stopped. Overseeing the combat was a referee, or sometimes two. He was usually a retired gladiator himself, a man who knew the rules. He was called the Summa Rudis, and he carried a long staff, the Rudis, which he would use to separate the fighters if they were locked in a stalemate, or to enforce the rules. Yes, there were rules. Certain moves might be forbidden. If a gladiator fell, his opponent might be expected to let him get back up. This was a professional sport, and it had officials to ensure it was, for lack of a better word, fair. When a gladiator was defeated, he would drop his weapon and shield and raise a single finger on his left hand. This was the gesture of appeal, the ad digitum. He was surrendering, and now came the most dramatic moment of the entire day. The defeated gladiator's life was no longer in his own hands. It was in the hands of the editor, the sponsor of the games, and the editor, being a savvy politician, would look to the crowd. The entire amphitheatre would erupt. If the defeated gladiator had fought bravely, if he had shown courage and skill even in defeat, the crowd would roar for mercy. They would shout "Mitte," let him go, and wave cloths or handkerchiefs in the air. They wanted to see him live to fight another day. He had earned their respect, but if he had fought poorly, if he had been cowardly or clumsy, the crowd would be merciless. They would scream "Egugala," slay him, and give a gesture with their thumbs. Now that gesture, we all picture the thumbs down of a Hollywood emperor. The reality is a little more debated among historians. The Latin phrase is pollice verso, which literally means with a turned thumb. It might have been a thumb pointed up, to symbolize a drawn sword. It might have been a thumb pointed towards the throat, or it might have been the thumb jabbed out to the side. Conversely, the gesture for mercy, police compresso, was likely a thumb tucked into a closed fist to symbolize a sheathed sword, but whatever the specific gesture was, its meaning was unmistakable. The roar of 80,000 people, channeled into a single unified demand for life or death, was a powerful force. The editor, or the emperor if he was present, would be the final arbiter. He would read the mood of the crowd and make his decision. He could, of course, overrule them, but it was politically risky. To grant a pardon to a gladiator the crowd despised could make him seem weak. To condemn a fighter the crowd loved could make him seem tyrannical. Most of the time he would give the people what they wanted. He would make the gesture. If it was mercy, the defeated gladiator would be allowed to limp from the arena, to be treated by the doctors and live to fight another day. If it was death, the victor would step forward and perform the final duty. He would dispatch his opponent quickly and professionally. It was not an act of rage, but of grim finality. After the body was removed, the day would continue with another fight, and another, until the sun set. The victorious gladiators would receive their prize money, and the palm of victory. The dead would be dragged out through a specific gate, the Porta Libertinensis, named after the goddess of funerals. Attendants dressed as Charon, the mythical ferryman of the underworld, would poke the bodies with a hot iron to make sure they were truly dead, while another attendant dressed as the god Mercury would touch them with his caduceus. It was all part of the theatre, a final morbid flourish to end the spectacle. The sand would be raked clean, ready for the next day's games. So why? Why did the Romans, a people of incredible legal, architectural, and administrative sophistication, embrace this culture of state-sponsored death with such gusto? The answer is complex, but it comes down to a simple and brilliant piece of political engineering, known by the Latin phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses. The city of Rome had a massive population, much of which was unemployed or underemployed. This was a vast, potentially volatile mob of people living in crowded, unsanitary conditions. A hungry, bored, and angry populace is the greatest threat to any ruler. The emperors, starting with Augustus, realized this, and they devised a simple solution: keep them fed and keep them entertained. The state organized massive distributions of free grain, the bread, and for entertainment, they provided the games, the circuses. It was a colossal social welfare program, designed not out of compassion, but out of a cold, calculated need for self-preservation. A citizen who has just received his grain dole and is looking forward to a free day of spectacular entertainment is far less likely to riot, far less likely to question the political status quo, far less likely to worry about the loss of his republican liberties. The games were a powerful sedative for the masses. But they were more than just a distraction. The amphitheatre itself was a microcosm of Roman society, a physical reinforcement of the social hierarchy. The seating was strictly segregated by class. The emperor and the Vestal virgins had the best seats right down at the front. Above them sat the senators, above them the equestrian class. Then came ordinary Roman citizens, the plebs, and at the very top, in the nosebleed section, sat the poorest of the poor, the slaves and the women. Everyone had their place, and everyone could literally look down on the classes below them and up to the classes above. When you went to the Colosseum, you were reminded of your exact position in the great pyramid of Roman power, and at the very apex of that pyramid was the emperor. His presence at the games was a vital piece of political theatre. He was seen by his people not as a distant, abstract ruler, but as one of them, sharing in their passions, enjoying the same spectacle. When he made the gesture that decided a gladiator's fate, he was performing the ultimate act of power, the power of life and death, right before their eyes. But by often bowing to the will of the crowd, he also created the illusion of popular consent. He was showing them that their voice mattered, that he was listening. It was a carefully managed piece of public relations, making absolute autocracy feel like a partnership. The games were a reflection of Roman values, or at least the values the state wanted to promote. They celebrated military prowess, courage in the face of death, and contempt for weakness. They demonstrated, in the most visceral way imaginable, the reach of the empire, the futility of resistance, and the brutal consequences of crime. They were a festival of order, power, and death, all staged under the warm Italian sun. It was the greatest show on earth, a theatre of cruelty that served as the bloody glue holding the whole magnificent, terrifying Roman world together. It was a spectacle for the people, paid for by the elite, and its ultimate purpose was to ensure that everyone, from the senator in his marble seat to the gladiator dying on the sand, knew exactly who was in charge. Infamy and adoration, the paradox of the gladiator celebrity, and yet for the gladiator dying on the sand, the question of who was in charge was both brutally simple and maddeningly complex. On one hand, the answer was obvious. It was the magistrate in the stands, the lanestee who owned his body, the emperor whose thumb could seal his fate. But as he lay there, hearing the roar of 80,000 people chanting his name, a different kind of power filled the air. It was a power he generated, a raw, electrifying adoration that belonged to him and him alone. For in that moment, the man who was legally less than nothing was in practice the most famous person in Rome. This is the central, almost baffling paradox of the gladiator. To understand it, we first have to wrap our minds around a concept the Romans called infamia. It's a rather delicate, almost poetic Latin word. It translates, with a distinct lack of poetry, to being legally and socially classified as scum. A person marked with infamia was, in the eyes of Roman law, a non-entity. They were forbidden from voting, from holding public office, from representing others in court, and even from testifying on their own behalf in most cases. They existed in a state of permanent civic disgrace. Actors, prostitutes, pimps, and gladiators, they were all lumped together in this category of the untouchable. They were, legally speaking, ghosts, human-shaped holes in the fabric of Roman society. So you have this man who, according to the official rulebook of the empire, barely exists. He's a slave, a condemned criminal, a prisoner of war, or maybe even a desperate free man who sold his own body and rights for a chance at a payday. He is owned, body and soul. He lives in a barracks that is, for all intents and purposes, a prison. He eats what he's told, trains when he's told, and fights whom he's told. His life is a debt to be paid in blood, either his or his opponent's. By every metric of Roman respectability, he is at the absolute bottom of the heap. And then the gates of the arena swing open. He steps out onto the hot sand, and the entire world shifts on its axis. The roar of the crowd is a physical thing, a wave of sound that washes over him. 80,000 people, from senators in their finest linen to bakers still dusted with flour, are on their feet, screaming his name, his stage name, of course. A name designed for maximum impact. A name like Flamma, the flame, or Ferox, the fierce, or Spiculus, the sting. He is no longer a legal ghost. He is a living legend. For the next 20 minutes, he is the center of the universe. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of crowd hysteria. This was genuine, widespread, deeply ingrained celebrity culture. It was a level of fame that we would recognize instantly today. These men were the rock stars, the heavyweight champions, and the blockbuster movie heroes of their day, all rolled into one blood-soaked package. And we know this not just from the grand histories written by senators, but from the humble, everyday stuff they left behind. Let's take a walk through the streets of Pompeii, a city frozen in time by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD. The walls of the city are, in essence, the ancient world's internet forum, its social media feed, and they are covered in graffiti about gladiators. Scratched into the plaster of taverns, bakeries, and private homes are messages from the fans. We find things like, Cression's the Netman holds the hearts of the girls, or the more direct, Celadus the Thracian, the glory of the girls, the delight of the girls. This isn't state-sponsored propaganda. This is the authentic voice of the Roman people, scrawling their adoration for their favourite fighters wherever they could find a blank space. It's the ancient equivalent of writing a band's name on your backpack or getting a tattoo of your team's logo. It's a public declaration of allegiance. These weren't just fighters, they were heartthrobs. And this merchandise, this cult of celebrity, went far beyond simple graffiti. If you were a wealthy Roman, you could commission a sprawling, intricate mosaic for the floor of your dining room, depicting your favourite gladiators in mid-combat. Imagine hosting a dinner party, reclining on your couch, sipping wine, while beneath your feet, the beautifully rendered images of Hermes and Hilarus are locked in eternal, tiled combat. These mosaics often named the fighters, listed their records, how many fights they'd won, a little V for Visi, he won, or a theta, the Greek letter that stood for Thanatos, death. This was the ancient world's version of a framed, autographed sports poster. It was a status symbol, a way of saying, not only am I rich enough to have this incredible artwork, but I have excellent and fashionable taste in public executions. For the common person, the options were more modest, but no less pervasive. You could buy little clay oil lamps, the primary source of light in most Roman homes after dark, and stamped into the clay of these lamps would be the image of a gladiator. Imagine a child doing their homework, the flickering light that illuminates their wax tablet, coming from a lamp decorated with the likeness of a man whose job it was to expertly dispatch other men in front of a cheering crowd. These images were everywhere, on pottery, on drinking cups, on little figurines that were perhaps the action figures of their day. You could drink your wine from a goblet showing a retiarius, the net fighter, tangling up a secutor. The sheer strangeness of it is worth pausing on. In our world, we put astronauts and firefighters on lunchboxes. We celebrate people who save lives. The Romans decorated their homes with the instruments of a state-sanctioned death machine. It speaks to a culture that had a fundamentally different relationship with violence. To them, the gladiator wasn't just a killer, he was an artist. He was the living embodiment of a core Roman value, virtus. Virtus meant courage, manliness, excellence, and a willingness to face death without flinching. A slave gladiator, in the act of fighting bravely, could display more virtus than a pampered nobleman, and the Romans, for all their rigid social hierarchy, absolutely adored that. He was a low-born man performing a high-minded virtue. This adoration, as the graffiti from Pompeii suggests, often tipped over into something far more personal and intense. Gladiators were, without question, the premier sex symbols of the Roman world. The appeal is not difficult to understand. Here were men at the absolute peak of physical conditioning. Their lives were a relentless cycle of training, discipline, and combat. They were living weapons. But it wasn't just about muscles. It was about the danger. The proximity to death gave them an aura, a charisma that was apparently intoxicating. Roman satirists like Juvenal wrote scathingly, and perhaps with a hint of jealousy, about the effect these men had on the women of the upper classes. He tells the story of a senator's wife named Epia, who abandoned her husband, her family, and her city to run off to Egypt with her gladiator lover. Juvenal drips with contempt as he describes her beloved Sergius. He wasn't young, his face was scarred, his arm was mangled, he had a wart on his nose, he was, by the standards of classical beauty, a wreck. And yet Epia saw him as a hero. Steel is what they fall in love with, Juvenal sneered. The sword, the shield, the helmet, this was the ultimate aphrodisiac. She chose the grit and the scars of the arena over the perfumed comfort of the Senate house. And this obsession could manifest in truly bizarre ways. One of the most peculiar cottage industries to spring up around the arenas was the trade in gladiator sweat. After a fight, an attendant would scrape the sweat, dirt and blood from the victor's body using a curved metal tool called a strigil. This grime, this essence of the gladiator, was then bottled in tiny vials. It was sold to wealthy women as a face cream or an aphrodisiac. They believed that by rubbing it on their skin they could absorb some of his power, his vitality, his virtus. It was, and I mean this with all the historical seriousness I can muster, the most intense and disturbing celebrity perfume in human history. Imagine paying a fortune for a small bottle of grime scraped from a man who had just survived mortal combat. It's a level of fandom that makes waiting in line for concert tickets seem rather tame. Of course, this fame and adoration wasn't just for show. It had a very real, tangible benefit: money. While the vast majority of gladiators were slaves who saw none of their own earnings, the successful ones, the superstars, could become wealthy men. A victory in the arena didn't just mean you got to live another day. It came with a prize purse. The amount varied wildly depending on the importance of the games, but a top-tier fighter could win a sum that was more than a legionary soldier earned in an entire year for a single afternoon's work. And that was just the official payment. On top of that were the gifts, the donativa from wealthy admirers. a magistrate who sponsored the games, a rich merchant, or even the emperor himself might single out a particularly impressive gladiator and shower him with gold coins, silver plates, or other luxurious items. The crowd loved this. It was part of the spectacle, a demonstration of generosity and a reward for courage. This created a strange financial ecosystem. The gladiator himself, if he was a slave, didn't technically own any of this. It all belonged to his Lannister, the owner of the gladiator school. The Lannister was a combination of fight promoter, prison warden, and ruthless talent agent. He would take a massive cut of all winnings and gifts. He was investing in these men, feeding them, housing them, training them, and he expected a spectacular return on his investment. The champion gladiator was a cash cow, an asset to be managed and exploited for maximum profit. But even with the Lannister taking his cut, a gladiator could accumulate a peculium, a sort of personal savings account that a slave was allowed to keep. With enough victories, a gladiator could amass a small fortune, enough to buy lavish comforts, to support a family on the outside, or even, in some cases, to buy his own freedom. This was the dream. This was the light at the end of the bloody tunnel. Survival was the short-term goal, but the ultimate prize, the retirement plan for every man who stepped onto the sand, was a single, simple object, the rudis. The rudis was a wooden sword, a simple training baton. But its symbolism was immense. To be awarded the rudis meant you were free. You had served your time. You had fought with courage and distinction. And your contract, whether it was one of servitude or a voluntary agreement, was fulfilled. It was the gladiator's diploma, his honorable discharge, his golden handshake. The awarding of the roofs was a public ceremony, often happening right there on the sand of the arena where a man had risked his life so many times. The magistrate or emperor presiding over the games would call the gladiator forward. The crowd, who had watched his career, who had screamed his name in victory and held their breath in his moments of peril, would roar its approval. To receive the roofs was the highest honor a gladiator could achieve. It meant you had not only survived, but you had triumphed. You had walked into the lion's den, again and again, and walked out every time. You had beaten the system. The life of a freed gladiator, a rudiarius, could go in several directions. Some, having had more than their fill of violence, would take their winnings and disappear, perhaps buying a small farm or a shop, and trying to live a quiet life. But how quiet could that life ever be? Your face was famous. Your body was a roadmap of scars, each one a memory of a day you almost died. The ghosts of the arena would not be easy to escape. Many others chose to stay in the world they knew. A veteran Rudarius was an incredibly valuable commodity. His knowledge of combat, of survival, of how to please a crowd, was second to none. Many were hired by their old Lannister, or a rival one, to become trainers. Imagine being a terrified new recruit, fresh off a prisoner cart from Gaul, and your instructor is Flammer, the living legend who fought 34 times and was awarded the Rudis twice. You would listen to every single word he said. These men became the coaches, the mentors, the keepers of the brutal flame. They might even act as referees in the arena, their authority unquestioned because everyone knew they had earned it in blood. Others might trade on their fame and fearsome reputation to become bodyguards for the wealthy. A senator walking through the dangerous backstreets of Rome would feel a lot safer with a celebrated, battle-hardened ex-gladiator at his side. But there was also a darker, more tragic path. Some men, even with the rudis in hand and freedom in their grasp, chose to go back. They signed new contracts and returned to the arena. Why? Perhaps it was the money. The pay for a star veteran returning to the ring was astronomical. Perhaps it was the adoration. A quiet life on a farm could feel awfully dull after knowing the thunderous applause of the Colosseum. That roar is a drug, and the silence that follows can be deafening. Or perhaps most tragically of all, it was because the arena was the only place they truly felt alive, the only place where the rules made sense. In a world of complex politics and social intrigue, the arena was simple. You win, you live, you lose, you die. For some, the cage of the Ludus had become the only home they knew, and the freedom of the outside world was more terrifying than any opponent with a sword. This was the life of the celebrity gladiator, a bizarre tightrope walk between infamy and adoration, between being legal property and a cultural icon. He was a man who was simultaneously despised and desired, a slave who was worshipped like a god. His image was stamped on the lamps that lit the homes of the very people who would be forbidden from dining at the same table with him. His sweat was dabbed onto the necks of noblewomen who would faint at the thought of visiting the barracks where he lived. He was a walking, breathing contradiction, a symbol of both the Romans' deep appreciation for courage and their callous disregard for human life. He was a product of a system designed to control the masses, and yet he was an individual who captured their hearts. Every time he stepped onto the sand, he was not just fighting for his life, he was fighting for his name, for the roar of the crowd, for the prize money, for the remote, shimmering possibility of that simple wooden sword. He was a disposable man who, through sheer will and terrifying skill, could make himself immortal. And that paradox, that incredible tension between the man on the legal documents and the legend on the sand, is what made the Gladiator the most compelling and tragic figure in the entire Roman world. His life was a testament to the fact that even when the system declares you a nobody, the roar of the crowd can make you a king, if only for an afternoon. The blood economy, the colossal industry behind the spectacle. But a king, even a temporary one, needs a kingdom. An afternoon monarch needs a castle, a court, and a stage. The roar of the crowd doesn't just materialize out of thin air. It has to be bought, it has to be built, it has to be supplied. And while the poet might see the gladiator as a tragic hero, a figure of incredible solitary courage, the Roman businessman saw something very different. He saw a product, he saw an asset, a volatile, high-risk, incredibly valuable commodity at the very center of a colossal and utterly ruthless industry. We've stood with him on the hot sand. We felt the weight of the helmet on his head. Now let's pull back. Let's float up, above the shouting and the dust of the Colosseum, and look down not at the fight, but at the sprawling, intricate, and deeply strange machinery that made the fight possible. Because for every one man fighting for his life, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of others who were just at work. This was the blood economy, and it was one of the biggest businesses in Rome. At the heart of this entire enterprise, the spider in the center of a very complicated web, was a man known as the lanista. This was the owner of the gladiatorial school, the Ludus. And if you're picturing a noble, retired general teaching young men the honorable arts of combat, you might want to adjust the image in your mind. The lanista was, in the eyes of Roman high society, about as respectable as a pimp or a debt collector. He was an infamous, a man of dishonor, legally barred from holding public office. He was a merchant of flesh, a purveyor of death. And yet, the same senators who would publicly scorn him would privately invite him to their villas to negotiate multi-million sesterces deals for their upcoming games. He was the necessary evil, the man who handled the dirty work that made the glorious spectacle possible. Think of the Lannister, not as a teacher, but as a combination of a modern-day sports agent, a venture capitalist, and a very, very strict prison warden. His Ludus was his company headquarters. His gladiators were his portfolio of assets. Each one represented a significant upfront investment. He had to purchase the raw material, the slave, the prisoner, then pour money into them for years. Food, lodging, medical care, and of course highly specialized training. He was constantly performing a grim calculation. How much do I invest in this Thracian? He's strong, but he's reckless. What's the potential return on investment if he becomes a champion? What's the likely financial loss if he gets killed in his first match? It was a business model that would give any modern HR department a complete and total breakdown. The Lannister was a master talent scout. He'd frequent slave markets, not looking for strong backs to work a farm, but for a particular kind of physique, a certain spark of aggression in the eye, a desperate defiance that could be honed into a marketable skill. He'd walk down lines of chained men captured on the foggy borders of Germania or the sun-scorched plains of Syria, and he would be assessing them with the cold eye of a commodities broker. He wasn't seeing a person, he was seeing potential profit margins. That one has the reach for a spear, he might think. This one is built low to the ground, good for a shield and short sword. He was building a diverse team, a collection of fighting styles that he could lease out to the organizers of the games, the editores. His income came from these leases. An editor, a wealthy politician perhaps looking to win public favor, would decide to host a game. He would go to the Lannister and essentially rent his gladiators for the day. The fee for a standard run-of-the-mill gladiator was substantial, but the fee for a champion, a celebrity with a winning streak, could be astronomical. The contract, however, had a terrifying bit of fine print. If the gladiator was killed in the arena, the rental fee would suddenly multiply, often by 50 times. The Lannister was effectively selling an insurance policy on his own man's life. So while he wanted his gladiators to fight well and win, creating a name for themselves and increasing their future rental value, he also had a very powerful financial incentive for them to survive. A wounded gladiator could be patched up and fight another day. A dead one was just a massive, unrecoverable expense. This created a strange, almost grotesque parody of a caring relationship. The Lannister would invest in the best doctors, the Medici, to tend to his fighters' wounds, not out of compassion, but to protect his investment. A gladiator with a perfectly healed scar was a walking advertisement for the quality of the Ludus, and a testament to his own resilience, which in turn increased his market value. This brings us to the very first link in this long and brutal supply chain: the acquisition of the raw material itself. Where did these men come from? The majority, the bulk shipment of the gladiator industry, were prisoners of war, as Rome's legions marched across the known world. They didn't just conquer territory, they harvested people. Entire tribes could be defeated, rounded up, and shipped back to the heart of the empire. These men were often already trained fighters, strong and disciplined, which made them prime candidates for the arena. They were seen as the disposable spoils of victory, their lives forfeit the moment they were captured. For the Roman state, it was a perfect system. They defeated an enemy, and the survivors were then used to entertain the populace, reinforcing the idea of Roman dominance. It was a state-sponsored, self-perpetuating cycle of conquest and entertainment. Then you had the condemned criminals, the Noxi. These were men sentenced to death in the courts, but their death would be a public one, in the arena. They were the lowest tier, the disposable filler for the lunchtime executions or the wild beast hunts. There was no investment in them, no training. They were often thrown into the arena with minimal weaponry, or none at all, against professional gladiators or starving animals. Their lives had no economic value to a Lannister. Their only value was in the spectacle of their state-sanctioned demise. And then there were the slave markets, the bustling, terrifying hubs of human commerce, found in every major Roman city. Here the Lannister or his scouts would prowl, looking for individuals who fit the bill: a strong man who had been enslaved for debt, a captured pirate, or simply someone who had been unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The process was humiliating beyond our modern comprehension. Men would be stripped naked on a rotating platform, their muscles prodded, their teeth inspected, their bodies checked for scars or weaknesses, all while a price was haggled over. A man's entire future, his very life, could be decided by the quality of his physique and the depth of a buyer's purse. But perhaps the most fascinating category of all were the volunteers, the auctorati. These were free Roman citizens who, for a variety of reasons, chose to sign a contract with a Lannister and become a gladiator. Why would anyone do this? The reasons were depressingly familiar to us: debt, desperation, and a thirst for fame. A man might be so crushed by his debts that selling his own body into temporary servitude seemed like the only way out. He would receive a signing bonus that could clear his accounts and provide for his family. Others were ex-soldiers who knew no other life than fighting and were drawn to the structure and purpose of the Ludus. And some, a small but significant number, were aristocrats, thrill-seekers who craved the adoration of the crowd, the ultimate celebrity status in a society obsessed with spectacle. When a volunteer signed on, he swore a fearsome oath, the Sacramentum Gladiatorium. He swore to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. He was willingly surrendering his rights as a citizen, legally becoming a slave for the duration of his contract, which might be 5 years. In exchange, he got professional training, a chance at fame and fortune, and the immediate relief from whatever desperation had driven him there. For the Lannister, these volunteers were a mixed blessing. They were often highly motivated, but they were also more aware of their rights and could be more difficult to manage than a prisoner of war who had nothing. Still, a successful volunteer who became a champion was a massive public relations victory for the Ludus. It showed that even a free man would choose to be a part of their prestigious and successful operation. Once the Lannister had his stable of human assets, he had to equip them, and this gave rise to another major branch of the blood economy, the arms and armor industry. This wasn't a simple matter of giving every man a sword and a shield. Gladiatorial combat was a highly regulated and stylized form of entertainment. Each type of gladiator, the retiarius with his net and trident, the murmillo with his fish-crested helmet, the secutor, the hoplomachus, had a very specific, almost theatrical set of equipment. This required specialized workshops or fabricae, staffed by highly skilled artisans. Imagine these workshops, probably located in the grimy industrial quarters of the city. The air is thick with the metallic tang of hot iron and the acrid smoke of the forges. The constant rhythmic clang of hammers on anvils is the heartbeat of the place. Smiths, their bodies slick with sweat, are expertly shaping sheets of metal into the complex curves of a helmet or the intricate links of chainmail. Leatherworkers are tooling and stitching greaves and belts. Craftsmen are casting bronze decorations for a champion's shield, ornate carvings that are part of his personal brand. This equipment was not cheap. A good helmet, especially the elaborate fully enclosed ones worn by types like the Murmillo or Secutor, was a masterpiece of metalworking, designed not only to protect but also to intimidate and create a specific look. It was a significant capital expense for the Lannister. In fact, most of the armor was likely owned by the Lannister and leased to the Gladiator for his fight, much like the Gladiator himself was leased to the editor. If a piece of armor was damaged in the arena, it had to be repaired, another operational cost. If it was destroyed, it had to be replaced, and there was a constant demand for new, more impressive designs. An editor wanting to put on a particularly lavish show might commission custom-made armor inlaid with silver or tin, with plumes of brightly dyed ostrich feathers. The armourers were not just manufacturers, they were part of the fashion and spectacle industry of ancient Rome. They were creating the costumes for the deadliest show on earth. The quality of the weapons was of course paramount. A sword that broke at a critical moment could mean the death of a valuable gladiator. The smiths who forged the gladii, the short swords that gave the gladiator his name, were masters of their craft. They understood the precise balance, the right temper of the steel needed to withstand the brutal impact of striking armor and bone. The trident of the retiarius had to be perfectly weighted for throwing. The links of his net had to be strong and tied with lead weights to ensure it flew true. Every single piece of equipment was the product of a specialized supply chain of its own, from the iron mines in Spain to the forges in Rome to the final polishing before a match. But the human combatants were only one part of the show. For many Romans, the morning session of the games, the venations or wild beast hunts, was just as exciting, and this created an entirely separate, and arguably even more complex, logistical and economic challenge, the exotic animal trade. The sheer scale of this operation is difficult to wrap our minds around. For the inauguration of the Colosseum, the Emperor Titus presided over games that supposedly saw the slaughter of 9,000 animals. The Emperor Trajan, to celebrate his victory in Dacia, held games lasting over 120 days, involving 11,000 animals. These are staggering numbers. This wasn't a case of just rounding up a few local wolves or bears. The Roman public had a taste for the exotic, the strange, the terrifying. They wanted to see lions from Africa, tigers from the east, crocodiles from the Nile, bears from Caledonia, rhinos, hippos, elephants, ostriches, leopards, giraffes. The Roman state and its private contractors had to create a global supply chain for wild beasts. This was an immense undertaking. The military was often involved. Legions stationed in remote provinces would be tasked with capturing animals as a form of tribute. Entire units of specialized hunters, the venators, were employed. Imagine the scene. A team of Roman hunters, deep in the Atlas Mountains of North Africa, trying to capture a pride of lions. Not kill them, but capture them alive and relatively unharmed. They would use vast nets, pit traps and bait. It was incredibly dangerous, labor-intensive work. Once an animal was captured, the logistical nightmare had only just begun. How do you transport a very angry, very large leopard from the interior of Libya all the way to Rome? First, it would be put into a reinforced wooden crate. and loaded onto an ox cart. Then it would begin a slow, bumpy journey to the nearest port on the Mediterranean coast. All this time it had to be fed and watered, a dangerous and expensive task. At the port it would be loaded onto a ship. Special ships were likely built or modified for this purpose, with cages built into the hold. The journey across the sea could take weeks. Many animals died in transit from stress, disease, or improper care. For every one lion that made it to the arena in Rome, several others may have perished along the way. The cost of this loss was factored into the final price. When the ships finally arrived at the port of Ostia, the animals would be unloaded and transported to holding pens, or vivaria, near the amphitheatres. We can only imagine the smell and the sound of these places, a terrifying cacophony of roars, growls, and bellows from 100 different species, all crammed together in a state of fear and agitation. They were kept there, sometimes for months, until it was their turn to be released into the arena. This required another small army of workers, keepers, handlers, and veterinarians, all trying to keep these valuable assets alive and healthy enough to put on a good show. The market for these animals was enormous. Wealthy provincial governors might send a gift of a dozen lions to the emperor to curry favour. Ambitious politicians would spend fortunes acquiring a rare beast, like a rhinoceros, to make their games unforgettable. The price was determined by rarity, ferocity, and the difficulty of capture and transport. A bear from Germany might be relatively common. A tiger from Parthia was an object of immense prestige and would cost a fortune. This entire branch of the economy, from the trappers in the field, to the sailors on the ships, to the handlers in Rome, existed solely to provide a few moments of bloody spectacle for the Roman populace. It was an astonishingly inefficient, cruel, and expensive way to display the vast reach and power of the empire. It was a way of saying, we control the entire world, and we can bring its most fearsome creatures here to die for your amusement. So the gladiators are acquired and trained, the armor is forged, the animals are captured and transported. Finally, it's game day, and the amphitheatre itself transforms into a massive economic engine. Let's start with the audience. While many of the games, especially those sponsored by the emperor, offered free entry to citizens, this wasn't always the case, and free didn't mean there wasn't money to be made. The seating was strictly segregated by class, from the senators and equestrians in the front rows to the poor and women at the very top. Tickets, often small clay tokens called tesserae, were distributed for state-sponsored games. These were given out through a network of patronage. Your local official might give you one to ensure your vote. But for privately funded games, tickets were sold, and just as today, there was a thriving secondary market. Ticket scalpers, the locari, would buy up tickets and sell them at inflated prices outside the Colosseum. A good seat for a popular match could be a valuable commodity. Once inside, the crowd was a captive audience for an entire day, and a captive audience gets hungry and thirsty. A swarm of food and drink vendors would circulate through the stands. They sold simple fare: bread, cheese, sausages, and pastries like libum. Wine, often watered down, was sold in clay jugs. This wasn't fine dining, it was the ancient equivalent of stadium food, designed to be cheap, portable, and profitable. The contracts to be an official vendor at the Colosseum would have been lucrative and highly sought after. And then there was the merchandise. The Romans were masters of branding. The top gladiators were superstars, and their fans wanted souvenirs. Small oil lamps were manufactured with images of famous fighters in action. Pottery bowls and cups were decorated with gladiatorial scenes. Glassmakers produced intricate vessels showing specific matches. You could even buy figurines of your favorite champion, the ancient Roman version of an action figure. The names of gladiators like Flamma, Spartacus, or Crixus were known throughout the empire. Their images sold products, making them some of the earliest professional athletes to have their own line of merchandise. An entire industry of artisans and retailers depended on the fame generated on the arena floor. And of course, there was gambling. While officially frowned upon in some contexts, betting on the outcome of the matches was rampant, and a massive, unregulated part of the economy. Romans would bet on everything: which gladiator would win, whether a man would be granted his life, how many animals a particular hunter could kill. Touts would work the crowd, setting odds and taking wagers. Fortunes could be won and lost on the turn of a single sword fight. This shadow economy added another layer of frenzied excitement to the proceedings, and moved vast sums of money from hand to hand with every drop of blood. The editor, the man funding the whole affair, was at the centre of this. For him it was an immense financial outlay. He was paying the Lannister for the gladiators, the animal traders for the beasts, the musicians, the attendants, the stagehands. But it was an investment in his own career. A spectacular game could win him public adoration and votes in the next election. It was a form of political advertising, and the cost was simply part of the campaign budget. A successful game could make a political career. A disappointing or cheap-looking one could ruin it. The pressure to constantly escalate the spectacle, more gladiators, more exotic animals, more elaborate stage machinery was immense. Finally, after the last fight is over, the last animal is slain, and the crowds begin to file out. The work is still not done. The blood economy had an aftermath sector as well. A crew of workers had to enter the arena for the gruesome task of cleanup. They would spread fresh sand to cover the bloodstains, drag away the bodies of men and animals, and repair any damage to the arena surface. It was a grim but necessary job. The bodies of the slain gladiators had to be dealt with. A special attendant, dressed as Charon, the mythical ferryman of the underworld, would ritually tap the fallen on the head with a hammer to ensure they were truly dead. Then they were carried out through the gate of Libertina, the goddess of funerals. What happened next depended heavily on the gladiator's status. A condemned criminal's body might simply be dumped in the Tiber River or thrown into a common pit. But a professional gladiator, a man who was part of a Ludus, often had a plan in place. Most gladiators belonged to something called a collegium, a sort of burial society or fraternal organization. They would pay monthly dues into a common fund. In return, the collegium guaranteed them a proper funeral and burial if they were killed. This was deeply important to the Roman mindset. A proper burial ensured that your spirit could find peace in the afterlife. To be left unburied was a terrifying prospect. These collegia would purchase a plot of land for a cemetery and would pay for the funeral rites, a memorial stone, and sometimes even a feast in the fallen gladiator's honor. The tombstones that have survived are incredibly poignant. They list the gladiator's name, his fighting style, his number of victories, and often a simple message from his comrades or his wife. To Flamma, the secutor, who fought 34 times, won 21 times, fought to a draw 9 times, and was granted his life 4 times. He lived 30 years. These stones are the final receipts of the blood economy. They are a testament to the fact that even within this brutal, commodified existence, these men sought a sliver of dignity, a way to be remembered as more than just an entry on a Lannister's ledger. They formed their own communities, their own support systems, and created a microeconomy dedicated to ensuring they would not be forgotten. So when we look at that lone figure on the sand, we should see not just a fighter, but the final bloody product of an unimaginably vast industrial machine. He stands on a stage built by a legion of architects and labourers. He wears armour forged by master craftsmen. He fights an opponent sourced from a distant land by slave traders and trained by a ruthless businessman. He may even face a beast captured on another continent and transported across the sea by a small army of hunters and handlers. He is watched by a crowd that is a market in itself, buying food, souvenirs and gambling on his life. His every move is underwritten by the immense wealth of a political class that sees him as a tool for their own advancement. The games were not a frivolous sideshow to the Roman world. They were deeply embedded in its economic and social fabric. They were a jobs program for thousands, a driver of global trade, a vehicle for political ambition, and a brutal reinforcement of imperial power. Every roar of the crowd was the sound of coins changing hands. Every drop of blood watered a complex and thriving industry. The gladiator may have been king for an afternoon, but his kingdom was built not just of sand and stone, but of contracts, supply chains, profit margins, and the cold, hard calculus of the Roman economy. And it is in the quiet hum of that colossal, invisible machine, working relentlessly just beyond the arena walls, that we find the true, sprawling, and deeply unsettling story of the games. The last triumph, the fall of the arena, and the rise of a modern myth. And like any colossal machine, especially one fueled by money and blood, It has a finite lifespan. No engine runs forever. Eventually the gears begin to grind, the fuel becomes too expensive, and the people in charge, well, they start looking for a newer, more efficient model. The sprawling, unsettling story of the games is not just about their operation, but about the day the machine finally shudderingly fell silent. For centuries, the roar of the crowd in the Colosseum was one of the fundamental constants of the Roman world. It was a sound as reliable as the rising of the sun, a civic heartbeat that pulsed with every contest. But nothing is permanent. Empires fray at the edges, economies shrink, and most dangerously of all, ideas change. The end of the gladiatorial games wasn't a single dramatic event. There was no final, tearful championship match where the last gladiator laid down his sword and walked into the sunset. It was a slow, quiet, and complex unravelling, a death by 1,000 cuts administered over centuries. The first and perhaps most relentless force working against the arena was simple, brutal economics, that colossal machine we spoke of, with its supply chains and contracts and profit margins, required a colossal amount of fuel money. The games were, to put it in modern terms, a jaw-droppingly expensive subscription service, and the price was always going up. Sourcing exotic animals, training and housing gladiators, maintaining the vast amphitheatres, it was the budget of a small war, repurposed for an afternoon's entertainment. For a long time in the golden years of the empire, this was fine. Rome was rich. The emperors and wealthy senators who sponsored the games saw it as a necessary expense, a PR move to keep the population happy and distracted. It was the ultimate bread and circuses. But then came the 3rd century, and what historians politely call the crisis of the 3rd century. This was less a crisis, and more a 50-year-long imperial panic attack. Barbarian invasions, civil wars, rampant inflation, plagues. The empire was teetering on the brink. Think of the late Roman Empire as a sprawling corporation that had overexpanded. It had too many branch offices on volatile frontiers. Its logistics were a nightmare, and quarterly profits were way down. And when a company is in that much trouble, the first things to get cut from the budget are the non-essentials, the lavish holiday parties, the corporate retreats, and the city-wide festivals where people are publicly murdered for sport. Suddenly, sponsoring a grand munus looked less like a civic duty and more like a reckless extravagance. The well of private wealth that had funded the games for so long was beginning to run dry. Emperors, now more concerned with paying their increasingly mutinous legions, started diverting funds away from the arena and towards the frontiers. The games didn't stop overnight, but they became smaller, less frequent, and less spectacular. The parade of giraffes and rhinos and elephants gave way to more modest local affairs with boars and dogs. The supply chain of spectacle was breaking down. The machine was sputtering. But while the economic engine was failing, a new and powerful idea was quietly rewriting the empire's cultural software. It was a philosophy, a faith, that had started as a fringe movement in a distant province and was now spreading like a quiet fire through every level of Roman society, and its core tenets were fundamentally incompatible with the operating system of the arena. This, of course, was Christianity. It's easy to imagine a simple conflict. Christians said killing is wrong, and Romans said no, it's fun. And eventually the Christians won. But the reality was far more nuanced and interesting. The early Christian writers, men like Tertullian, weren't just offended by the violence. Their critique went much deeper. To them, the games were a form of mass insanity, a spiritual sickness. They wrote with horror about the frenzy of the arena, the way the crowd lost its humanity, screaming for blood, their faces contorted with a pleasure that seemed demonic. They saw the games not just as murder, but as a pagan religious ritual. Every procession, every sacrifice, every invocation of the gods before a match was, in their eyes, an act of idolatry. To even attend the games was to participate in the worship of false gods, to pollute one's soul. They argued that watching a man die, even a condemned criminal, hardened the heart and closed it off to the compassion and mercy of their God. You couldn't, they argued, look upon the face of God on Sunday after you'd spent Saturday roaring for a man to be stabbed in the throat. For the first few centuries of the faith, this was an outsider's critique. Christians were a persecuted minority, and sometimes they were the ones in the arena, thrown to the lions not as combatants but as victims. This act, meant to stamp them out, had the opposite effect. It turned the arena, the ultimate symbol of Roman power, into a stage for Christian martyrdom. It created heroes for this new faith. The story was no longer about the gladiator's strength, but about the martyr's faith in the face of it. The moral center of the drama had shifted from the man with the sword to the unarmed person kneeling on the sand. Then, in the early 4th century, the game changed completely. The Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, the ultimate patron of the Roman state, the number one influencer in the known world, had adopted the faith that condemned the arena. Again, the change wasn't instantaneous. Constantine didn't issue an immediate, empire-wide ban on gladiatorial combat. That would have been like a modern government banning all professional sports overnight. The public outcry would have been deafening. Instead, he began a process of slow institutional discouragement. He passed a law in 325 AD, suggesting that condemned criminals should be sent to the mines instead of the arena. It was a subtle shift. The state was no longer officially endorsing the games as the preferred method of public execution and entertainment. His successors followed suit, gradually withdrawing the immense imperial funding that was the lifeblood of the great games in Rome itself. The message from the top was clear: this is old-fashioned. This is not who we are anymore. The aristocracy, always eager to curry favor with the emperor, began to follow the trend. Sponsoring a church or a monastery was now a much better way to show off your piety and social standing than funding a bloody spectacle that the emperor clearly disapproved of. The cultural currency of the games was in free fall. History loves a tidy ending, and for the gladiatorial games it offers up the story of a monk named Telemachus. The tale goes that in 404 AD, during a gladiatorial contest in the Colosseum, this humble monk leaped into the arena to try and separate the combatants, crying out for them to stop in the name of Christ. The crowd, furious at the interruption, allegedly stoned him to death. The Emperor Honorius, so moved by the monk's sacrifice, was said to have banned the games for good right then and there. It's a wonderful story. It's dramatic, it's poignant, and it's almost certainly not true. It was likely a legend invented later to give the end of the games a neat, heroic finale. The reality is much more, boring, and much more human. The last gladiatorial games in the city of Rome probably happened sometime in the early 5th century. There was no grand announcement, no final ceremony. They just stopped. The promoters couldn't afford them. The emperor wouldn't pay for them, and the public, while perhaps not fully converted to the new morality, had other things to worry about, like the fact that the Visigoths were about to sack the city. The immediate, terrifying threat of real-world violence has a way of making staged violence seem rather pointless. In the provinces, the games sputtered out even more slowly, fading away over the course of the 5th and 6th centuries, with beast hunts lasting a little longer. It wasn't a revolution, it was an obsolescence. The great amphitheatres fell quiet. The roar of 80,000 people was replaced by the whisper of the wind whistling through empty arches. The sand that had soaked up so much blood was gradually covered by weeds, and then by dirt. The machine had finally run out of fuel, its purpose rendered obsolete by a new world with new priorities. For almost 1,000 years, the gladiator, as a living, breathing person, ceased to exist. He became a ghost, haunting the ruins of his former stage. And this is where the second, and perhaps more enduring part of his story begins. The story of his resurrection. Because while the man of flesh and blood was gone, the idea of the gladiator was simply too powerful to stay buried forever. He was about to get a major rebrand. For centuries during the Middle Ages, the Colosseum was treated as little more than a quarry. Its stones were carted off to build churches and palaces. It was a relic of a strange pagan past. The gladiator was a half-forgotten figure from old books, a symbol of ancient cruelty. But then came the Renaissance. Europe began to look back at the classical world, not with fear, but with awe and inspiration. Artists and scholars began to excavate the ruins, to piece together the past, and they found the gladiator again. But they didn't find the low-status, desperate slave we've come to know. They found him in art. They found him in statues like the Dying Gaul, a masterpiece of Hellenistic sculpture depicting a defeated Celtic warrior, which was long mistaken for a dying gladiator. Look at that statue. He isn't brutal. He isn't a showman. He is noble, tragic, and beautiful, even in his final moments. This was the Gladiator reborn, not as an entertainer, but as a tragic hero, a work of art. He was stripped of his gritty, sweaty, desperate reality and transformed into a symbol of classical perfection and stoic suffering. This image of the noble victim persisted for centuries. Then, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the age of revolutions in America and France, the world needed a different kind of hero. It needed symbols of rebellion against tyranny. And who was a better candidate for this role than Spartacus? The historical Spartacus was a brilliant guerrilla leader who led a slave revolt that terrified the Roman Republic for 2 years. But we know very little about his actual motivations. In the hands of Enlightenment thinkers and 19th century romantics, his story was transformed. He was no longer just a desperate man trying to escape a death sentence. He was a proto-revolutionary, a freedom fighter striking a blow against oppression for all mankind. He was given speeches about liberty and human dignity that would have sounded utterly alien to him. The Gladiator was now more than a tragic hero. He was a political icon. This vision was cemented in the popular imagination by the great paintings of the era. Artists like Jean-Léon Gérôme painted vast, photorealistic canvases of the arena. His most famous, Police Verso, or Thumbs Down, essentially defined what we think the Colosseum looked like: the victorious gladiator, foot on his vanquished foe, looking up to the Vestal Virgins for the final verdict. It's pure drama, it's high art, it's also a complete sanitization. The stench, the flies, the raw, clumsy butchery of it all is replaced by a clean, theatrical, and almost heroic tableau. Jerome gave the myth its visual language, but the gladiator's final and most powerful transformation came in the 20th century, courtesy of a new kind of arena, the cinema. Film took this marble statue of a hero and breathed a new, compelling, and entirely modern kind of life into it. The first great pillar of the modern gladiator myth is the 1960 film Spartacus, directed by Stanley Kubrick and written by the blacklisted Dalton Trumbo. This film is barely about ancient Rome at all. It's a Cold War parable. It's about McCarthyism. It's about collective action against an unjust system. The most famous scene, where the captured slaves all stand up and proclaim, "I am Spartacus," to protect their leader, is one of the most powerful moments in cinema. It is also a profoundly, beautifully modern idea. The historical slave army was a fractious, brutal group that eventually split apart due to infighting. The idea of that kind of selfless, ideological solidarity would have been completely foreign to them. The film gave Spartacus a modern soul, turning him into a champion of universal human rights. And then, at the turn of our own century, came the film that would chisel the myth into its final, seemingly permanent form: Gladiator. Ridley Scott's 2000 masterpiece gave us Maximus Decimus Meridius, a character who is a perfect fusion of every mythical gladiator that came before him. He has the nobility of the dying Gaul, the rebellious spirit of the romanticized Spartacus, and the stoic philosophy of a Roman general. He is a hero completely out of time, a good man forced into a corrupt world, who fights not for fame or money, but for justice and for the memory of his murdered family. Think about the film's most iconic line: "What we do in life echoes in eternity." It's a magnificent, inspiring sentiment. It speaks to our modern desire for meaning, for legacy. It is also almost certainly not what a real gladiator was thinking about. A real gladiator's thoughts were likely much more practical. Parry left. Keep your shield up. Try not to trip on that patch of wet sand. Survive until the gate opens. Maximus is driven by a grand, sweeping vision of restoring the Republic. The average gladiator was driven by the hope of maybe, just maybe, earning his freedom and retiring to run a small wine shop somewhere quiet. Gladiator is a brilliant film, but it is the culmination of a 2,000-year-long process of myth-making. It completes the transformation. The gladiator is no longer a slave, but a hero. No longer a low-status performer, but a righteous warrior. No longer a victim of a system, but the man who brings that system crashing down. The film is so powerful, so convincing, that for millions of people, Maximus is the historical gladiator. And so, we arrive back here, in the quiet of the night. at the end of our journey. We have to ask the question, why have we done this? Why have we, as a culture, worked so hard to transform this brutalized entertainer into a shining hero? Perhaps it's because the reality is simply too uncomfortable. It's difficult to build a hero out of a man who was legally equivalent to a piece of furniture, who was forced to kill other desperate men for the amusement of a crowd. It's a story with no clear good guys. The truth is morally messy. It implicates the crowd, the system, the very idea of Rome that we so often admire. The myth, on the other hand, is clean. It gives us a simple story of good versus evil, Maximus against Commodus, Spartacus against Crassus. It allows us to experience the thrill of the arena from a safe moral distance, because we are rooting for the good guy. We can watch the spectacle without feeling like the Roman mob. The myth of the heroic gladiator is a beautiful lie. And like all the best lies, it contains a sliver of truth. These men did possess incredible courage. They did face death with a resilience that is hard to fathom. But their courage was one of desperation, not of ideology. Their resilience was that of a survivor, not a revolutionary. The real gladiator, the historical one, is a much more tragic, and I think, a much more human figure than the marble hero we've created. He is a testament not to the glory of combat, but to the incredible human capacity to endure the unendurable. He is a ghost who reminds us of the profound cruelty of which we are capable, and the strange, complex systems we build to justify it. When you stand today in the ruins of the Colosseum, or any amphitheatre across the old Roman world, it's easy to imagine the scene. You can almost hear the ghost of a roar on the wind. But the figure you picture on the sand below, is he the historical gladiator, the branded slave, the prisoner of war with terror in his eyes? Or is he Maximus, the general, the father, the husband, vowing his revenge, reality of his own time, and to be reborn over and over again in the stories we tell ourselves? The echoes we hear in those ruins today are not just his, they are our own. And now, it's time to let the ghosts of the arena fade back into the dust, and let the quiet settle in. Time to rest.